Hello, everybody. Much love and encouragement and hope to you all in the middle of all of this madness. Carolyn Baker and I have just produced, as you know, our manifesto and manual for getting through the global dark night with grace and joy and sacred action. And we've had the most astonishing response to this book, which has given us tremendous joy. And so we've decided to make a series of videos relating the central themes of the book to what we are all living right now, to try and show just how relevant what we have offered is to all of you and us too, as a way of really dealing at the deepest level with some degree of peace and truth with what's happening. So I'd love to begin by just thanking Carolyn for her amazing work and for suggesting that if you haven't read her latest book, Undaunted, which is a magnificent offering, I beg you to do so. It's the book that I gave to everybody for Christmas, and everyone who got it and read it is very impressed by its tone, because as with all of Carolyn's work, it's both very rugged and realistic, but also very, very inspiring. So if you want a concise statement of vision of how to live this period undaunted, please, I beg you, jump in and buy it. It's amazing. I'd also like to say that I would love to offer any of you who can't afford to buy Radical Regeneration a free copy. I'm going to have 10 copies, signed copies, and if any of you who can't afford it, send me your address, I will send you the book. But on the tender condition that you share it with everybody you know so the vision can be as helpful and as widespread as possible. So, Carolyn, many years ago, I was sitting with my great teacher, Father Bede Griffiths, and he said something to me which I didn't really understand at the time, but which has only grown more and more powerful as the years go by. He said, the secret to reality is the coincidence of opposites, the marriage of very extreme opposites in the mystery of the one. And he said that the crisis that is now going to break over the world, and he knew what was coming, is one that will demand of anyone who wants to rise to it a real attempt at the deepest level to hold the opposites and to hold them steadily, relentlessly, implacably, because it's from that holding of the opposites within you, within the vast spaciousness of your true heart, that you will be able to be fed the solutions and possibilities that you will desperately need to keep hope burning and to keep your energy aflame. What does holding the opposites, which I know is something very, very dear to you, mean to you at this moment of your life and at this moment of your witness?
Well, thank you for asking that question, Andrew. It is such an important piece of not only my spiritual path, but my way of experiencing and coping with what we're in the midst of right now. Now, you and I have been doing numerous interviews on our wonderful book. And a question that I constantly get asked, and I'm sure you do too, is, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And the person that speaks to this most dearly and closest to my heart is Meg Wheatley, who wrote this wonderful little book called Perseverance. And I want to read just a little bit of this section called Dwelling in Uncertainty, because she often gets asked this question, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And she says, either position, optimism or pessimism, keeps us from fully engaging with the complexity of this time. If we see only troubles or only opportunities, in both cases, we are blinded by our need for certainty, our need to know what's going on, to figure things out so we can be useful. The challenge is to refuse to categorize ourselves. We don't have to take sides or define ourselves as either optimists or pessimists. Much better to dwell in uncertainty, hold the paradoxes, live in the complexities and contradictions without needing to resolve them. Now, she is a spiritual teacher. She's a Buddhist spiritual teacher. But yesterday, I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson, one of the greatest astrophysicists who's ever walked
He's
the earth.
wonderful. Yeah.
And he said, so simply, it's okay not to know. It's okay not to know. So you and I are not optimists or pessimists, and just picking up Radical Regeneration, opening it to one page wherever, will show that. We are holding the tension in our bodies of complete annihilation of life on Earth, or the possibility of some kind of transformation and rebirth of our species and therefore the planet. So that's where I'm at with holding the tension of the opposites.
I love it. And I would love to say the following. When I get asked that question, I say I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I hope I'm becoming a realist. And for me, that's realist with a capital R, because for me, and I know for you, the real is the one, and the one creates through the opposites.
Yes.
And what is essential for me is to stay grounded in that direct connection with the one beyond good and evil, beyond body and soul, while containing those opposites within myself. And that requires very deep spiritual practice.
Yes.
I can't do it without deeply amping up my whole devotion. And when I do, and I do it as regularly as I possibly can in my crazy life, when I do, I find that I have the peace and the spaciousness to embrace all of the sometimes terrible and sometimes amazing possibilities that are arising simultaneously.
Right.
The other thing I'd like to say is that when I'm asked that question, I say both optimism and pessimism are inadequate responses, because if you think about it, they both make us passive.
Yes.
If you're a pessimist, you say there's nothing that we can do, so I might as well devote myself to sex, drugs, rock and roll, listening naked to Mozart in the afternoons, and just let the world burn, because whatever I do, it will be useless. So you sign off. If you're an optimist, you say it's going to be fine. It's going to be okay. There are wonderful people doing wonderful things. I don't have to be one of them. I might send the occasional check to the Sierra Club or give $10 to a homeless person, but I don't have to turn up because God's here and all those amazing people are here and they're going to do it for me. So both to me are corrupt approaches, because what this situation demands is three things. What it demands is that we get very serious about our spiritual practice, whatever it is, so that we can connect with the one and be fed by the wisdom and the spaciousness and the courage and the peace of the one. It demands that we unflinchingly face the predicament we're in and choose it as an assignment, not as catastrophe. Mm-hmm. And it demands that instead of being either optimistic or pessimistic, we develop what we've called in our book birth eyes. We develop the capacity through inner inspiration always to be able to see, even in very extreme circumstances, the little shoots of new possibility and hope and vigor and invention and courage and creativity that are emerging, and they are emerging. And there's a fourth thing, of course, that it demands, which is that we commit ourselves right now, in whatever way we understand it, to sacred activism. The answer to the question, are you an optimist or a pessimist, is, in my book, no, I'm an evolutionary mystic and I'm a sacred activist and I'm going for broke.
Right, absolutely. And I'd like to say something, add something about the practices. One of the things about the practices that we should really emphasize is that these are grounding practices.
Right.
They're not airy-fairy, oh, let's all ohm and shmoam and make everything better. They are practices for looking squarely at our predicament and then grounding ourselves. And one of the ways that we must ground ourselves, and it's not pleasant, we don't like it, but it has great rewards, and that is developing a relationship with the shadow. This is the piece that so many well-meaning spiritual groups miss. You know,
From my experience, and that's what limits their effectiveness. Yes.
right. And, you know, I felt so strongly about this in 2015 that I wrote a book called Dark Gold, The Human Shadow and the Global Crisis, in which I talked about all of the manifestations in the shadow, in what we're looking at right now in the collective events that are taking place. And this is even truer than it was in 2015 and 2023.
Shadow work permeates radical regeneration, and we approach it from many different angles. We approach it from the personal shadow that colludes with all the madness out there, and we show just how this unprecedented crisis is itself casting shadows, which, when we become aware of them, we needn't be so paralyzed by them. So one of the things that I think distinguishes the book that we've done from many other noble adventures into the future is that we are the most unflinching people as far as the shadow is concerned, because we've seen all kinds of well-meaning adventures founder in inanity and new age pseudo-optimism, which is not going to help us in a situation as extreme as this. The only thing that will help us is this marriage of deep shadow work with profound grounded spirituality that opens us up increasingly to our innate divine consciousness and how it's established not only in our mind and heart and soul, but actually also in our body, so as to strengthen us to be able to hold the opposites.
And you know, you and I do a lot of work with folks around the shadow, and it's really important to say that shadow work is very exciting, because in it we discover, okay, so we look at the darkness in the shadow, but in doing so, it releases a great deal of creative energy that we have been using to keep that shadow hidden, right? So
Right.
it's very positive in that sense. And also, as we do shadow work, we discover beautiful parts of ourselves that we've had to send away in the past that can really empower us in the present time. So you can't lose
Absolutely.
either way doing shadow work.
That's such an important point, because one of our most crippling shadows is the way we've allowed conventions and family and karmas and traumas to imprison our innate splendor, our innate creativity, our innate passion. And when you get just how your shadow has prevented you from living the fullness of who you are, a great joy comes, because now you see why you've limited yourself and sabotaged yourself. And you also are given distinct clues as to how to release everything that you've kept imprisoned, release it into compassionate, skillful action, all the more compassionate and all the more skillful, because through excavating your own shadow, you're given far more insight into why people are doing whatever they're doing.
Yeah. And, I've found in doing my own shadow work and continuing to do so,
Oh, God,
that
yes.
it has really increased my sense of compassion for myself and therefore for the world.
And it gives you patience, doesn't it?
It does.
Because one of the things that we need desperately in a situation like this is a marriage, again, a marriage of extreme urgency and just as extreme patience. I love what Erasmus said, hurry slowly.
Yeah.
The more difficult the situation, the more you need patience,
Yeah.
because the more you come to understand the depth and range and intricacy of the forces ranged against you, which doesn't depress you, but just makes you more steady and more able to negotiate reality with real skill.
Well, we're also facing, we need to all do our personal shadow work, but we're also facing tremendous shadow in the collective. And maybe we can talk about that a bit.
I'd love that.
Yeah.
We're clearly experiencing an orgy of the collective shadow. It is erupting in shameless brutality everywhere.
Yes.
Just yesterday, I saw a video of Nazis confronting Jewish rabbis as they come out of synagogue and shouting things like, "You dirty Jew," and "I hope you like being in an oven," all this kind of crazy, nasty ferocity. But that's happening on every level of our collective in every part of the world at the moment.
Right.
And one of the reasons it's happening, I believe, is that because you cannot make the evolutionary leap we're celebrating in our book, Radical Regeneration, without facing this shadow which has been denied and tamped over and cosmetized for so long. It has to be faced to galvanize you, to claim it, integrate it, and transcend it. And
We
that
all
is where we are.
we all know, you and I and anyone who's familiar with shadow work, that when you don't deal with it, it only gets bigger and darker. And so, yes, there's the manifestation of the Nazis, harassing the Jews as they come out of synagogue. There's also the subtler, not as obvious forms, which has to do with the attacks on Black history, on, the history of our country. And I say this as a person who used to teach history in college.
Yes.
And that I had the privilege of watching students over the time that I taught them become extremely excited about learning not only the good stuff in our history, but the dark stuff. And they said to me, "This gives me so much more perspective. It makes me really appreciate, what we have fought for." And so here we are in the United States. We're seeing all these manifestations of shadow and fascism. And worldwide, we're seeing many, many countries going further and further right, taking that path historically toward full-blown fascism.
But at the same time, and this is what we're going to be talking about, at the very same time, you have Biden standing up in Kiev after a 10-hour train journey, giving the speech of his life and mobilizing everyone who can listen to a vision of democracy, to a vision of freedom that we now all need to realize is fragile, and we now all need to support, not just with our thoughts and votes, but with our actions. So you can see in the situation that you're describing, you can see on the one hand this explosion of fascism, and on the other hand, growing more and more eloquent, more and more focused, more and more intensely practical every day, a vision of freedom and democracy. And that is how the divine is working to try and help us get to the next stage of our human evolution. And our task, and we've said this in so many ways in the book, is to develop what we call birth eyes, so that in the middle of being overwhelmed by the agony that the eruption of the shadow collectively is causing, we don't lose our senses. We keep one eye open for what Mr. Rogers called the helpers. Look for the helpers. So let's look at 4 things that are erupting now that cause us all the most ultimate concern in this way. One eye absolutely seeing without flinching the horror, and the other eye attuned to what the horror is activating in people who are prepared to wake up, people of goodwill.
Right.
So let's look at gun violence first. And I wonder what I chose it first because I know you've just been through a very personal experience of gun violence. And before I ask you what that was like, I would just like to point out to everybody something many of you probably know, which is that there have been 83 mass shootings this year alone. This is far more than an epidemic. This is an exploding radioactive tragedy on a cosmic scale. And it is properly, deeply frightening for all of us to think that if we go to the ATM or to the supermarket, we can get shot by somebody out of their mind who's got permission to have an assault rifle. It's very scary, and I know many of you are properly scared by it. But how did you feel about what you've just been through? What happened to you?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I have not been in a mass shooting myself, but it's been very close to me. 2 years ago, in 2021, there was a mass shooting here in Boulder, Colorado, that took out 10 people in a supermarket in an area that I actually used to do some work in. And so that was very close to home. And more recently, within the past couple of weeks, there's been a mass shooting at Michigan State University, where I got my bachelor's degree. And of course, I was not there, but my heart is so attached to that community because that university was really a birthplace for me. And so, you know, I'm noticing more and more, as so many people are saying, that it's really becoming scary to go to the bank, go to the grocery store, just be out and about. Places that we never ever thought were dangerous are now potentially very dangerous. And, you know, we've just come off this 3-year pandemic where we've been isolated and we've wanted to get out, get out, get out. And now we're getting out and realizing maybe I don't really want to get out. Maybe I want to go do my business out there as quickly as I can and get back home. Which is really ironic after 3 years of staying home.
When I rang you just after the Michigan State trustee, you were in real shock and real sadness. And I know you so well, and I never heard you so low and so deeply sad. What process did you go through absorbing what happened through this lens of holding the opposites? How did you get through that process? What was that process like? Because I'm sure your description of it will help many people who are going through similar processes.
Well, first of all, the first shootings took place in a building where I had many, many history classes. And in fact, it started in a history classroom. And I know that building very well. I don't know if I had a class in that room back in the day, but I know the building well. And I recall that, I graduated from there in 1970. And I recall very distinctly, I was very much an activist, and we were protesting the Vietnam War all over the place. And on May 4th, 1970, that was 2 months after I graduated, the Kent State shootings happened. And I remember how terrified we were that in our protesting, the police would come after us and start shooting at us. And none of us had lived through mass shootings in schools. None of us had had active shooter drills. But I realized as I was listening to these young students who survived that many of them had been through mass shootings in grade school. One woman from Sandy Hook, one woman from the Parkland shootings, another woman from the Oxford, Michigan shootings, and on and on and on. So here's a whole generation of kids, young people, who have been through this practically since birth. And what kind of culture are we creating? What are they going to have to face? And of course, they're also facing climate chaos. And they don't know if they have any kind of future.
What I was asking you is, how did you get through that period? What came to you to steady you in the middle of that recognition?
Truthfully, I would have to say the work that we are doing, the work that I am doing, and writing a book like Undaunted, and having people gather in a study group to study the work and the practices in Undaunted, and the interviews that you and I have been doing with people who are wildly coming to recognize this book as kind of a Bible of our times, in a sense. I'm able to be grounded by that, even as I look at the horrors that are all around us. It's the practices that we have lived, you and I, that we continue to rely on, that help us maintain sanity and centeredness in this horror.
So what you're saying is, when you are directly afflicted by horror, go deep into yourself, find that place of silence, of peace, of spirit, and plunge more devotedly, more focusedly into creativity, into sacred action, into whatever you know is helping. That's the way, isn't it?
And not only going in, but going outward. There were
Right.
so many things I wanted to do. I wasn't able to go back to Michigan State, but I wanted to. I wanted to join the women, the mothers who were walking around campus with these signs that said, MSU mother, here, do you want a hug? I wanted to go back and talk to the students and support them and be of service in some way. I wasn't able to physically go back there and do that, but that's the kind of thing that we're called to do in these tragedies, is go in and then go out with compassion to support people who are more closely connected with the tragedy.
When I contemplate and feel deeply the horror of this explosion of gun violence and try and take in 83 mass shootings, I'm overwhelmed. And then I remember I remember that there are millions more people awake to the horror of gun violence now than there have ever been. I'm not an idiot. I see how slowly, how excruciatingly slowly the government on both sides is moving to address it. But the fact that this horror is activating such a radical, passionate response amongst people of all ages, all sexes, all colors who realize that it portends terror for the future, that gives me rugged hope. And at that moment, what I do is pledge my voice, whatever I can say, whatever I can advocate, whatever I can write, to helping those people who are rising up to get strong and focused and relentless. Because as you and I both know, real change sometimes goes excruciatingly slowly. And people who truly see that it is essential have to be able to ground themselves for a long haul. And I believe that as an elder and as a spiritual teacher, my job now on the earth is to train those as far as I can to offer what I've learned from my long struggles to them, to give them the courage to continue, because I believe that as many more people arise and put more and more intolerable pressure on Congress and on opinion, there is a good chance that this could be turned around. So I see horror as the potential incubator of radical new possibility. And I try and feed that possibility with everything I know and everything I am.
Well, along those lines, I was trained as a psychotherapist originally, and what this is doing, all of these shootings, is awakening not only the mental health community, but people in general to the role of trauma, the role of trauma in the nervous system, and ways that we can heal it. And so I am very excited about that, because really this is the first time in America that we've really looked at trauma this deeply and looked at ways to heal it. So if there is any kind of, and I hate to use the expression silver lining, but if there is any kind of upside to this horror, that's one of them.
You see that silver lining in a man like Fred Guttenberg, and I don't know if
Yeah.
you've seen him on TV,
Yes.
but he's
Oh, yeah.
somebody who I'm just awestruck by,
Yes.
someone who lost a daughter and who didn't fold into despair and paralysis, but has dedicated the last decade of his life to do everything he can.
Right.
And after the Michigan shooting, he was on TV, I think it was with Joy Reid, and she said, "Does this drive you to despair?" And he said, "Absolutely not. It just makes me want to do more and more and more. Because instead of growing paralyzed by what's happening, what I've decided to do is to use what's happening to make me more focused and more adamant in my advocacy." I just reeled, because that to me is the truth. That's the truth.
And I also reel at the survivors like David Hogg, who was
Yes.
a survivor of Parkland, who came
Beautiful
out of these
person.
tragedies and are now profound sacred activists, and are really, really, speaking for their generation and confronting the hell, literally, out of these people who are adamant and about guns. They want to keep their guns, and they're all in bed with the gun manufacturers.
This goes back to your point about the shadow, our point in the book.
Right.
the tragedy of the New Age and of nearly all the so-called new organizations for oneness and all the rest of it is that they play down the shadow.
Right.
And one reason they do is because they don't secretly want to be so confronted by it that they have actually to do something.
Right.
So it's a very convenient way of not being so hurt by what's happening that you finally find the resources within yourself to actually turn up. So it's no surprise that none of these organizations are really supporting sacred activism, because what they're doing is fundamentally plastering cosmetics over a wound instead of healing it. And the only healing, as we propose in Radical Regeneration, is through unflinchingly accepting what's going on and allowing the process itself to bite so deep that eventually you find yourself willing to actually stand up for those who are being so grievously wounded.
Well, the major mental illness of the Western world is narcissism. And when we're in our narcissism, and we're all afflicted by it to some degree, when you're really in your narcissism, it's like you don't want to feel bad. All you want to feel is good. You want happy talk and happy feelings and happy experiences. And so there's this dichotomy, there's schizophrenia that has developed around
It's
spirituality.
psychosis.
Yeah, around spirituality and the shadow. Jung is the great master teacher who brought those together. But otherwise, most spiritual groups are not wanting to feel bad. They want to feel good. And so they don't look at the shadow. And even if you're not in a spiritual group, the tendency in this culture, for example, with climate change and certainly with mass shootings, is to just not look. I'm just not going to look at that because it makes me feel bad. And nothing is more important than feeling good.
Let's go to our next horror, and that
Let's
is
do.
the gathering attacks on democracy. And you and I have been saying now for 20 years that democracy was fragile, that there would be an authoritarian movement, that fascism would arise. And when Trump came, we identified him as the harbinger of this terrifying darkness in a way that I think many people were shocked by at the beginning, but now realize was accurate. And here we are living at a time in which, after 2 years, those responsible for the insurrection have still not been held to account, in which the Republicans in Congress are led by avowed insurrectionists like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and all the others. Sorry about Marjorie Taylor Greene, I couldn't help that, and please forgive me. But this is a time in which it is quite clear that there is a significant minority in this country prepared to lie, prepared to do any kind of violence, prepared to destroy the legal system to get through an authoritarian vision. How do you face that? How do you see this eruption and feel
Well,
this
one
eruption?
of the things that inspires me is my sacred activism, which is to produce 7 days a week a daily news digest, in which I take economic, environmental, world news, all the different kinds of news, and report in general about them, and then conclude with an inspiration section. And on Sundays, I publish something called the Sunday Post, which is always a story of inspiration standing alone by itself. So being informed and helping other people be informed is one of the ways that I ground myself in that. But we are still hanging by our fingernails on a cliff of what is left of democracy in this country. And I was very encouraged by the 2022 elections. People did not go en masse, over to the right wing. So I was greatly encouraged by that. And I think Biden is one of the best presidents we've had since FDR, maybe the best. And we are still in massive danger because 30% of this country still believes that Trump was elected for a second term. 30% of this country will still vote for him if he runs again. We can only hope and pray that he will not even be nominated by the Republican Party because he's got so much baggage. But Ron DeSantis is very likely to supersede him and be nominated. Whether he's charming or not, these folks don't care. They want to have their guns. They want to ban Black history. They want to get rid of LGBTQ people. And the very wealthy want to get rid of safety nets and programs that actually help people. So we are still in grave danger, and we've got to do our work as sacred activists.
The hope that I have in this extreme situation, and I see it as dangerous as you do, is that many more people are now aware than they were 5 years ago of gerrymandering, for example, and of the real fascist ideology that underlies this horrible adventure.
Yep.
5 years ago, when we were talking about this possibility, people looked at us sweetly and patronizingly, and you could see them thinking, these two mad old broads are really in their own world. Now they realize that we were seeing things clearly, and they are much more awake to the shadows in American history that have produced this. But that kind of awakening is just the beginning, as you said. It's essential to really take it in and realize how deeply rooted all of these tendencies are and where they're rooted and why they express themselves in the way they do. But then you have to take up your responsibilities as a citizen. You have to play your part in the democratic world if you're going to preserve it. You can't sit back and wait for something wonderful to happen or a great leader to arise. You have to really get going. And I think that was one of the most remarkable things about the 2022 election, which was not only that people didn't go to the right, but that massively new amounts of young people voted. The whole African American population came out against this madness, a great deal of it, 90% of it. So there is a progressive clarification and galvanization of citizenry. And I beg everyone listening to understand finally and forever that being spiritual does not mean that you can sign off from your responsibilities, political and economic, your responsibilities as a citizen. In fact, in this situation, as Carolyn said, it means that we all need to take them very much more seriously, to come together, to organize, and realize that if we don't rise up together, the most precious thing that we have, freedom, democratic freedom, will be destroyed soon.
Absolutely. Democracy is messy. It's messy and it takes a long time. And, it's a process that, the very wealthy and a lot of the not very wealthy look at our system and say, that's too messy, it takes too much time, let's do this boom, boom, boom fascism where we get things done. Well, we get things done for the benefit of the rich. We get things done that violate the earth even further than it has been violated. So we really have to think deeply. And I get this same thing you do, this dichotomy, this false dichotomy between spirituality and politics. Nothing could be more spiritual than my concern for the well-being of my community. And so I'm going to do everything I can to marry spirituality with activism. And you wrote the whole book on it, Sacred Activism. That's what we're being called to be and to do right now.
Let's look at our next horror, and that is police brutality, which I know you and I, when we talk so often about the scandal and horror of so many African American young men being killed shamelessly and even recorded being killed by the police. How has this affected you, and what possible hope do you see in this galvanizing new response?
Well, African American men and women, let's not forget Breonna Taylor
Of
or
course, you're so right. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sandra Bland.
Yes.
It's fine. But it's
I'm so filled with
African
the images of
American.
Tyree Nichols. I have not been able to sleep having seen that video. It was so terrifying.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
but you're right.
And so what we have to look at is the systemic racism, not a white policeman and
Right,
an African American victim,
right.
but rather, the Tyree Nichols certainly pointed to systemic racism in that he was murdered
By
essentially by
black
four
cops, yeah.
black cops. And so we've got to look at that. And I want to really recommend, if you have not watched the 1619 Project from Nicole Hannah-Jones, which is now streaming on Hulu, you must. It's 4 episodes of the best African American history I have ever seen. And it, many white people are going, oh, this is so extreme. Come on, this didn't really happen. And I suppose these are the same people that want to ban African American history from being taught or not. But it really is important to watch that series because we need to understand systemic racism,
Right.
not the individual incidents, but how this is all inculcated in our institutions, not just law enforcement, but healthcare and the legal system and many education for
Economic system, which still paralyzes a whole part of the African American population.
absolutely. Absolutely. And so we've got to understand systemic racism, and we can be reading books like, Ibram Kendi's book and other books.
Well, the best book I would suggest for everybody is Isabel Wilkerson's great, groundbreaking, astounding book, Past, which has just been issued in paperback with a magnificent introduction in which she relates the themes of the book to what is now going on in the country. There is no wiser, more grounded, more lethally awake guide to this than Miss Wilkerson, who has been, for me, a source of enormous sorrow and inspiration. I thought I knew something about African American history. I'd read a lot of books. James Baldwin is my favorite American writer. But until I read Isabel Wilkerson, there were depths of depravity that I had not really understood. And it was a deeply painful but profoundly awakening experience.
So I
So
want to recommend that book, Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, Caste, and Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project. If you have those two things in your consciousness, you will be a different person. You'll be a different kind of American.
So one of the birth effects of this horrific explosion of violence is that it is allowing precisely these kinds of conversations to take place. And one of the sources of hope for me is seeing millions and millions of white people turning up to support Black Lives Matters, to protest against these killings, to make sure that the legal system, as it did with Chauvin, actually starts to work. It's not fast enough, it's ambiguous, it's filled with institutional potholes in front of them on their road. But oh my God, again, 5 years ago, when I was talking about systemic racism, famous spiritual teachers were coming up to me and saying, "You've got to get over this. It's not working in our country. We elected a Black president. That racism is old hat." And I said, "Are you kidding me? I see it everywhere."
Yeah.
But the other thing I think that really gives me hope is that more and more of us, white people with privilege and power, and are willing to do the very painful shadow work of uncovering our own racism. I was born with Indian blood from imperial parents in India. And what woke me up to the world was discovering in my teens through my history teacher just how devastating the empire that my family had served really was. And it led to a kind of nervous breakdown in my teens, in which I became a Marxist revolutionary and tried to burn down figuratively the whole house that had sheltered me. But without that recognition, I would be nowhere. But then there was another recognition that came when I was actually traveling in India in my early 20s and found myself talking to the waiter in a way that I recognized to be the voice of my imperial family, that I hadn't cleansed myself and my psyche of that unconscious sense of superiority that fueled the empire. So one really important part of sacred activism in this situation is for all of us to go through that grueling experience of uncovering our unconscious racism, not just understanding the history, not just understanding that it is structural, but understanding that we have colluded with it in ways that we now need to make conscious.
This is part of the white shadow. And I've never met an American who isn't racist, including myself. And it is an ongoing cleansing that needs to happen, that we need to be willing to take this on. And the thing that just makes me absolutely irate is when I hear a white person say, "I'm not racist." There is no white person in this country who is not in some way racist. So we need to be willing to explore that. That's part of our white shadow.
And
And
it is a sacred activist act in itself because it
yes,
opens you up
yes,
to
yeah.
the horror of what's going on and it urges you to do something about it. And when
And
I,
contrary, if I could just say,
of course, darling,
contrary to this whole Ron Santos perspective,
right.
it's not, you know, it's not about, oh, this will make me feel bad. Once again, it's not, what matters is not that I'm always feeling good. I watched my history students when I taught American history. I watched them say, "Oh, I didn't know we did this to Black people," and it wasn't about, "Oh, I should beat myself up with, whips and chains," but rather, "I'm so sorry. And what can I do differently?" That's what
Can I
real
be
history.
differently? Yeah.
How can I be differently, behave differently? That's what real history teaches us. And so it's really important that we get over this. I got to feel good as an American. I got to feel good as a spiritual person. No, I need to look at my shadow. And that's going to be very liberating. If we can look at how we've participated in the racism, and we all, white people, we all have ancestors who were involved in this. So let's get over this I'm not racist, please.
And let's also, as we get over it, look to the absolutely astonishing African American women who are rising en masse and taking very considerable roles of power and influence. I'm amazed by how many of them there are and how extraordinary their tone is. It's very unflinching, but very compassionate, very invitational. It teaches me how to teach. They have been through everything. They know the score, but they know that there is a distinct possibility that all this horror can awaken another level of conscience and another level of commitment to racial equality and undoing the structures that perpetuate it. They know that, and they've dedicated their lives to making it possible, and they're relentless and they're magnificent.
And do you think we're lucky to have a Black vice president?
Pinch me. I wish she was being allowed to do more. And I know that there are a lot of problems in her office. I have friends who know her very well. But I think in the next 2 years, we're going to see the woman she really is come out. And I
do too.
have actually met her, and she's she's amazingly intelligent and charming and sincere. And I'm looking forward for all of America to realize just who they have in her.
Absolutely.
Darling, we're at the end of our time, and I thought, with your permission, that I'd end this with a prayer from Joanna Macy. And I know I will have no quarrels from you
Well,
because
only if you allow me to read a very short passage from Mary Oliver after that.
I will allow you with joy and grace, because I know the consequences of what would happen if you didn't. What a wonderful conversation. I'm so happy that we're starting to do this. I think we're going to be able to help people. I so hope.
Yes.
Keep alive the possibilities in the middle of the chaos. It's to see this evolutionary movement as a marriage of opposites.
And we have not even talked yet about possibility, the field of possibility and quantum physics and,
Oh,
the
there's
stuff
a
we
lot
wrote
we're going
about
to
in
keep.
Radical Regeneration.
Of course not. We're just starting.
Right.
This is Joanna Macy's prayer for future beings. I love this prayer, and it's something you alerted me to, and we put it in Radical Regeneration on page 111. You live inside us, beings of the future. In the spiral ribbons of our cells, you are here. In our rage for the burning forests, the poisoned fields, the oil-drowned seals, you are here. You beat in our hearts through late-night meetings. You accompany us to clear-cuts and toxic dumps in the halls of the lawmakers. It is you who drive our dogged labors to save what is left. O you who will walk this earth when we are gone, stir us awake. Behold through our eyes the beauty of this world. Let us feel your breath in our lungs, your cry in our throat. Let us see you in the poor, the homeless, the sick. Haunt us with your hunger, hound us with your claims, that we may honor the life that links us. You have as yet no faces we can see, no names we can say, but we need only hold you in our mind, and you teach us patience. You attune us to measures of time where healing can happen, where soil and souls can mend. You reveal courage within us we had not suspected, love we had not owned. Oh, you who come after, help us remember we are your ancestors. Fill us with gladness for the work that must be done.
That is so beautiful. Thank you for reading that. It's extraordinary. Well, in Radical Regeneration, we have 4 books that we have written together, published in one volume. And one of the books in that volume is Return to Joy.
Yes.
So I'd like to read a little passage from Mary Oliver about joy. She says, "Don't hesitate. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb."
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you.
And to all of you out there, we love you. We're here for you. If you've enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends. And please share the vision of radical regeneration. We're not going to be able to buy real estate in Bora Bora off the sales of this book. We spent 5 years working on getting it as clear as possible. We published all of the different books ourselves because we didn't want anyone to edit them, so that eventually we could present the whole vision to you at a moment when we feel its truth is now obvious. So please, if you haven't bought the book, do so. And again, if you can't afford it, there are 10 books here that I would love to send to you personally as a token of my respect for everything you are.
And you can learn more about each of our work at andrewharvey.net and carolynbaker.net.
Thank you all.